Okay, yeah, so like what's the topic?
So I just think like that the topic can be like from like God's existence.
Oh yeah. So when you say something about God's existence, what do you hold towards that? So like when I ask you like what's your account of God's existence? Like do you believe he does exist? Like what do you define God as? Like a necessary being or like, maximally great being?
So like when I define God, I obviously hold that God's existence can just be some form of necessary grounding. Considering the analytical, just like analytically speaking, that's a normal grounding for it would be. I misworded that horribly. Let me restate it.
Oh yeah, that's fine. Just take your time.
Okay, so when I found God, analytically speaking, he would already be a necessary being. There's nothing really which is necessary.
Yeah, but like there kind of is. So when you define God, God isn't necessarily going to be an necessary being because obviously he would have to be a grounding. But when you define God, there's things like rational agents. There's things which would you would hold to necessarily like moral nature or rational nature within God or something like that. Like say for an example of like actus spiritus, you would view that God is existentially identical towards his essence, his nature basically in that sense, and you would just hold that as pure actuality. Things which would be properties in that sense would be descriptors.
That is that can be like as like a very sort of like I would say more so when it comes down to spirits. I wouldn't do the spirituality part or like the part because like when you define like properties of like God, when you say there's a descriptor, it has to be prescriptive that this is a descriptor. So when you use a descriptor or representation, basically analytically what it is when you give an account of what a descriptor is, or you necessarily give some form of analytical framework to work under, there would have to be a prescriptive definition of what God is because that's how necessarily God's properties work under specific standards and like obviously you'd have to define them, otherwise he exists virtually speaking because there's no real distinctions within Octus Spirits. Obviously, holding to that, obviously speaking the actus spiritus stance, it's going to have to be a prescriptive definition of what we enforce within a definition, within that set of like descriptors, because obviously properties of God would include a plural set.
First of all, when you mention something like a prescriptive definition, obviously it's going to have to be the case. The descriptor, virtually speaking, there cannot be no logical distinction or analytical distinction between what it means, because obviously an analytical distinction would bring up a distinction within definition. Obviously, the descriptor in the first place, you can't have a synthetical distinction of it because that would obviously also entail different distinct sets of semantics, which allow for that preservation of properties or just ontological sets of things. It wouldn't necessarily be a real entity, but more so, obviously, you would have to grant prescriptive things, but more so, that's prescriptive descriptors. Descriptors can still be applied. I don't see why descriptors are still applied. They're still descriptors. It doesn't change the fact. You're just going to have to force a descriptor the same way. There's nothing which actually regards how a definition or a descriptor would have to enact this way, specifically speaking.
So to understand this properly, you are basically just saying that like in like more trying to say through implication or like clarity of what you're saying.
Hear you because you had a bit of a background problem, but yeah, hold on. Yeah, what I'm basically just saying is that it's still a descriptor. It's just telling you what the descriptor is. It's still a descriptor. You can still apply descriptors. There's nothing which tells me that you would have to entail a specific descriptor this way unless you assign or attribute this specific descriptor towards that entity. That's you assigning the descriptor. That doesn't contradict the descriptor in itself. Unless, of course, the being in itself, and like obviously the there's virtual distinctions and logical contradictions within the descriptor and how it's being applied towards essence. Like say for example, like if I define God within the set of actus purus, right? Or the setting of actus purus, sorry, or just the account given. If I say morality is basically God, moral nature is like the descriptor which is identical towards God because it's necessarily his essence, but not necessarily the real essence, because that's like what's entailed within actus purus and what absolutely in like ADS. Obviously, I'm saying that this descriptor is something assigned to God or the being who is identical to its essence, you know? So, if that is the case, it's still a descriptor. The definition is still distinct because, hold on, let me explain something to you. You are enforcing in the way which it fits the essence. There can be no other way. Like, that's why I'm saying it doesn't. Ew, what the fuck? Sorry, there was some on my computer. But silly speaking, it would be enforced in such in which, specifically speaking, it's only assigned towards essence and nature. It's just going to be the nature of God as a descriptor. It's not prescriptive. The definition in itself cannot have a prescriptive way in which we enforce it. It's just still strictly going to be a descriptor towards essence. There's no other way in which you can grab that. Hello, are you there? Hello? Hello, hello, hello? Bro, where did you go? You're on deafen? Why are you on deafen? Okay, you know what? I'm just gonna continue. I don't mind the background noise. I'll give you a chance to review because I'm sure you heard about it. You weren't like on deafen. I like came into that stuff.
So what you just described is basically just telling me that there is a specific, you're gonna have to enforce that description or what's basically defined as. Defining something is just giving a term a something which you refer to by. It's still just your explanation of what it's supposed to be or what the term is. You know, it's still a descriptor and still a way we describe it. It's the way in how we constantly reference. So it's still an epistemological necessity when referring to the spirits to actually uphold the spirits and identify what's epistemically acceptable within the spirits. There can be no other like thing in the so you know that's what I mean by prescriptive.
Yeah, so prescriptive descriptors. It's just enforcing it in a way which should be right. When I am saying it's still a descriptor, there's no actual way in which you would prescribe it as or enforce it as. The descriptor is still representation. You don't assign the descriptor a certain prescription because that would make it prescriptive towards the being. That it follows that this is the prescriptive thing towards the being. That this is a property. Wouldn't say it's more so a property, sorry, but I would say more so that it's still a prescriptive thing when referring to quote unquote properties because it would be a part of the set of attributes which can be more so referential towards the essence of a being, more so, the description part. Representation is not necessarily accurate. So it wouldn't be accurate in that sense. So it's still a representation, not prescriptive. Because, obviously speaking, the contradiction being that actus purus actually upholds no prescriptive thing. That's still a prescriptive thing of actus purus. You have to enforce that it's actually simply is essential, which is the reason why you can't have any prescriptive description. Okay? Because that makes actus purus prescriptive, even though, or just like a certain thing of him prescriptive to refer to. You can't have descriptions as prescriptive in the first place towards a being. So if I say morality is God's nature and pure actuality is this specific morality, morality would be pure actuality, therefore God is identical towards this, therefore is identical towards his essence. So in that sense, if that's the case, I'd be saying it's prescriptive that this is the case, but obviously it's a representation because God has no real like entities within it, which invokes ontological parsimony.
So it's wrong in the first place and contradictory towards what we were referred to as like the first place. Because I'm saying when you refer to this term as a description, you still have to hold that it is this description. Otherwise, that would be a virtual distinction, which is contradictory towards ADS, etc. Wouldn't be able to assign that property. So if you assign that property, the descriptor is contradictory. Therefore, also making some form of complex thing and complexity within the structure of this pierce, even though there cannot be any. That would be more so like in the sense of parsimony. Ontological parsimony asserts less in the same no descriptor by that sense when you refer to it as a term. You give a definition to it. It would have to be specifically descriptive as a term. Otherwise, there's a virtual distinction which contradicts the descriptor. Therefore, contradictions exist within the representation of the essence. Therefore, adding a specific property and then a part to it, which would be composition, which is contradictory towards scholastic philosophy. If you can actually dub that, then obviously you might be a bit retarded, speaking.
Okay, so that specifically is also referring towards the point of more so speaking the specific terminology and origin. I'm still saying it's a description which doesn't affect the essence in itself. You're saying this would affect the essence, therefore we can't uphold this as a descriptor. Okay? Okay, that's cool. It will be a false representation, but that doesn't necessarily contradict the ADS in the sense where we cannot hold to it. So I'm still saying even if it's a descriptor, you can't really prescribe this thing to it as like a correct definition within ADS because of that same thing you mentioned, the property assignment. That would be more so an attribution which would have to be enforced within that specific definition, therefore creating some form of complexity rather than, the identical to this part, which would be less, more so entities. than what you are trying to invoke. So if you prescribe a definition that creates less simplicity, which absolute divine simplicity is supposed to invoke, ontological parsimony, a less real distinct entity.
Yeah, you might be mentally inept because that's real distinction. Talk about virtual distinctions. So you can't really like say that's going to be category if it's virtually distinct in that sense.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm still saying that you would be referring to the essence as a descriptor term. Even then, therefore creating that the essence still has ways you can refer to it as having properties and like predicates and etc. Or formal distinctions. Formal distinctions are just something that's like logically grounded, but also formally grounded, like also just ontologically grounded, but more so conceptually grounded as well. So when you hold towards that, it would be a formal distinction. You can't hold formal distinctions within that. So if you're talking about virtual distinctions, by that point, it's still also targeted towards the essence in that part. It's still also targeted towards the specific ontological part about the parsimony and what's referred to as the essence. If you prescribe a term towards the essence, which is just supposed to be identical to its existence, his existence also has more entities within it. His existence. Hello? Hello, hello, hello. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? So I'm just gonna continue on my point. So when you refer to prescriptive definitions, obviously speaking, um, obviously with obviously holding the formal distinctions point I mentioned, or giving the account of the formal obviously speaking because you're not too much there. I don't know what's going on with you. You're disconnecting. You're coming back in. But formally speaking, you are still withholding that there's something within the nature which can be referred to, which is the essence, can be referred to despite just being it's identical to its existence. It wouldn't have any other thing which can refer to it like that because that's a contradiction towards it just being identical towards the existence. You'd be saying this is the existence of that specific thing, right? So if that's the case, then you're contradicting it just simply being an existence thing. You'd be saying there's properties within it which you could refer to its existence, which would allow for the point. Like formal distinctions would just suggest some, obviously it can be distinct conceptually, but really they might not be basically referring to the ontological part. Sorry, I got cut off by some retards in my background. But so when you refer to that specific thing within ontological parsimony, You were still saying there's specific descriptors which have to be prescribed towards that essence, right? So if that's the case, obviously speaking, you'd be saying something else is also actuality in terms of the wording, more so it was supposed to be a definition towards the essence part. His nature is supposed to be referred to as this thing, even though it's not prescriptive. But conceptually, like say for example, the example about morality. Morality is definitely distinct in conception, but more so not separable from the essence. Okay, but morality, moral nature, if it's actual and it's the nature, that implies some form of moral nature that other than existence, because that implies morality is existence. But obviously, if you say it's a descriptor of essence or so, it wouldn't be prescribed then, which is my original point. It wouldn't be prescribed in terms of really, it would just be a conceptual thing, which is logically and virtually accepted. So you can't sit here and say it's also going to be the main point about the fuck. Yeah. It's a descriptor which allows for the prescriptive thing about essence, which virtually speaking is a distinction. It allows it's permissible for an account of logical things, but if it's not really a thing, it's a prescriptive thing for essence. That means that these things are inseparable. But you sit there and say they're logically separable, that would infer a contradiction because logically speaking, then you know you are allowing for something that's supposed to be the same in terms of ontology or an ontological framework to logically not be valid or taken as the same thing. That would imply contradictions. Again, that's the reason why you cannot have prescriptive descriptors. It's only a thing which is supposed to be a representation. It's not the accurate thing, which is why you can't hold prescriptive descriptors in the first place, and why it's supposed to be enforced that way. It cannot be enforced because of that specific thing. Things which can be derived from definitions, conceptuals, or logical virtuous distinctions. Because logically speaking, say for example, obviously speaking, within ADS, within ADS, logically speaking, it has to be accepted as the same thing if it's really this. It's like really the same as well, like ontologically. It's not. It's also a contradiction, logically speaking, towards the essence, which is why metaphysically does not work. The act of existing is contradicted because it's another thing which is being simplified or indexed towards ontological parsimony, which is another real entity. The act of existence, which is supposed to be taken as, pure actuality of God, the real grounded act. There's another act within God, which would be another really distinct thing, due to the logical virtual distinction. So, obviously speaking, the prescriptive scenario just fails. It just has to be descriptive representation, which can be in terms of terminology, but you can't sit here and say the descriptor can be prescribed or enforced as an accurate thing in terms of that terminology. It can only be enforced as terminology, not necessarily accurate terminology, as I'm saying. The distinction between accurate terminology and obviously speaking the point about terminology which is supposed to fit for a descriptor is that accurate terminology is supposed to be analytically the case. Here's the thing, terminology is supposed to fit is only colloquial, appropriate. Doesn't mean it's analytically the truth. It's only appropriate for the context in which you're implying, which could also imply specifically some form of like synthetical implication, which is severely distinct and severely also different from that entire point. So the syntax does not match up, and analytically also distinct because one refers to that entire point of accurate terminology, analytically right, analytically prescriptive, also just colloquial, the other one. Colloquial is just appropriate. Accurate is supposed to be right. One is appropriate, but the second one must be enforced as right. Appropriate is just something which can be taken to be accurate or something which fits it. Doesn't necessarily mean what fits it is necessarily the right choice for that or supposed to be enforced as the accurate one choice. Because, say, for example, like LEM, we accept both things are the case if something's supposed to be the truth. If it's just fit for the scenario, but also not what's needed, and you're also saying that it is what's needed, there's indispensable, and then it is dispensable. There's just like so many contradictions, which is the reason why you're retarded. Oh, and he left. Goodbye, Seiba. I won.